Thank you. There's a big cathedral behind me, kind of, and it's bonging away now because it's the bong time, I guess. Yeah. So thanks. Great intro. It makes me want to like talk about the intro for 5 minutes instead of starting the talk. But just really quickly with that Steal My talk in Rotterdam, like the whole thing, I generated a talk with Python and some AI stuff. And now just after last year, like the whole talk has to look so lame compared to like all the stuff that is just easy that anyone can do right now. Like it was really fun to do, but it's funny how talks can expire like that. And hopefully this talk does not expire. That's my segue. Yeah, so I'm Aaron. I'm living in Vienna, Austria. I've been here for a long time. I am originally from the Seattle area in the States, but I guess I'm part maybe I've soaked up the culture here. I'm part Austrian now. I'm going to be looking down a lot because my monitor is like down low, and I'm trying to see the crowd because it's not in my main screen. So sorry about the unprofessionalness of looking diagonally down constantly. Yeah, but anyway, this talk is about testing OTP and kind of complexity, I guess, in a sense, with working with that. Yeah, so I've been working on a large Elixir project for the last over 2 years now, which is strange because I normally have very short contracts, like 2 or 3 months. And it's been for a German energy company, and they decided to build this complex architecture in Elixir to deal with kind of real time looking at the energy grid and be able to make decisions and look at kind of where there's energy congestion. And it's a super interesting and boring contract to work on at the same time. It's like lots of cool Elixir stuff going on with just tons of services communicating with each other. But then we're also dealing with like SFTP servers and XML files and things like that the whole time. So it's kind of this mix from like one sprint to the next. Is it going to be like, am I changing the XSD XML validation, or am I like building this new piece of infrastructure that talks to all of these other things? So, but what I found in the last 2 years, especially of this project, it being a larger project, is that generally my experience with Elixir and with OTP and all these things is that it works with my brain, and the way you solve problems are the way that like it makes sense for me to solve problems. So a lot of things come very, very easily. But once we get into these complex systems, testing starts to become very, very hard. And just a lot of my pain in my daily work comes from testing processes mostly. And when I'm saying OTP, what I mostly mean is gen servers. That's what I'm working with mostly. I'm not like doing a bunch of gen event stuff or yeah, I guess a little bit. Some of this relates to supervision trees, kind of how things are started, but this is mostly about processes and gen servers. And hopefully we can come up with some practical and effective like testing ideologies or some tools that we can use. And in the end, the goal is to have it so CI isn't randomly crashing because of some bug that doesn't really make any sense. So what I'll kind of the structure of this talk is that I will kind of look at a problem. I have two main problems I'm going to look at, kind of explain the problem, look at a couple of solutions to the problem, and like kind of go into kind of real use cases. The code is pretty much almost all of it is pseudocode, not pseudocode, but like made up code because I didn't want to talk to the company that I'm working for and ask them to say, okay, you can use our code. But a lot of it really closely mirrors real use cases for this energy project. And then a side project that I've been working on called Foot Race, that's like a running racing app, like a chess app kind of, where you pair with other runners and race them in like 5K races and stuff. So there's like little pieces of real application, or at least pseudo real application code here. Yeah, and as I was doing research for this talk, I saw that there already was a talk with a similar name. There's just one part missing from Andrea, and it's yeah, it's a fantastic talk, and I highly recommend it. And what he says in this talk near the beginning is, hey, this isn't a cookbook. I want to talk about kind of how to think about testing. And my talk is more like a cookbook. It's kind of like, here's a problem, here's some possible solutions. So maybe you can think of this as like a workbook for his talk. My kids are getting workbooks all the time for their math and things to work in. But I highly recommend watching his talk. It's great. Yeah, please go ahead and do that after this. But without further ado, let's get into the guts of the talk, I guess. And the first thing that I would like to go into, what I'd like to talk about, is kind of this idea of singletons that we're using quite often, especially in example code that I'm looking at and code that I've written in the past, especially before working on more complex applications, is dealing with global state with singleton processes. And there's a few reasons why we choose to choose to solve certain problems like this with singletons. One of the main ones is like with our database connections. So our ecto repo, for example, if we're doing things like in-memory repos, so we want to store, we're using a repository pattern a lot at my company. And so we're kind of like, we're consuming Kafka queues and then pushing them into these in-memory repos. And these things live in singletons. And for example, if I want to connect to RabbitMQ or MQTT or Kafka, I might want to store that connection in a singleton. And what I mean by singleton is generally this: you have a gen server that you start with the module's name as the name. What that means is that you can only refer to that. You can refer to this module by its name. You don't have to give it a PID or a name when you're calling functions to it. But what it also means is there can only be one of them in the system. And yeah, for a long time, I use this pattern constantly. I'm like, there's only this one thing that I need. So why don't I name it that and simplify everything? And yeah, you can see just an example here of like, instead of fetch all, you actually normally would need to use the PID or the process's name to call out into a function inside of a gen server that's running. So where we start to feel pain is when we start to want to test these processes. Yes. So here's an example of just a basic key value server. I called it foo just to be very descriptive. And we name it the module name. Yes. And then, yeah, so I actually screwed up this example. Wonderful. Yeah, so normally you would not have this server in here. You would have it be just, you can call get with the key. Perfect. In this case, yeah, fantastic example. Yeah, and you just have this put and this get. And how you would use that is, yeah, so you could actually, so I'm going to step back. Yeah, so in this case, we can use this in two different ways. We can call it by the server name, or we can call it by its own name. And in this example that I've given here, we use start supervised. We get the PID for the server, and we call assert foo get. We give it the server name, and then we get bar out the other side. Perfect. It's a key value server. And I just want to go a little bit and describe what start supervised does. We can use start supervised in a test. I'll show an example again. You give it a child spec, which can just be the module name, and the arguments, or just a straight up child spec. And what happens is this process gets started and it gets stopped within the context of the test. So you don't have to worry about actually stopping these processes that are started. So it's a really handy tool to use. I also will use the bang pretty much always, because if the thing doesn't get started, I want my test to fail. So start supervised, wonderful. Yeah, so the problem that we have is this testing things that are named by the process name, these singletons. They work really fantastically until we start wanting to do async true. And then everything starts to fall down. So here's another example where we have this supervisor that started. We start the foo process, it's running. We put something to it, fantastic. We are doing that, we're really happy. This was our second started process. So what ends up happening is when I'm running both this foo test as well as this other test, since both of the supervised processes have the same name, we have this runtime error where it crashes, and the crash is already started foo. You can't start foo twice because there's already a process with that name. And what this can often lead to, if you're doing async true in your tests, is a like weird intermittent test failures in CI. So sometimes the tests are being run asynchronously. Sometimes they're not. And then you end up with situations like this where you're constantly just pushing over and over again to CI just to fix this stupid CI problem, which your problem actually was this asynchronous test. So you can see that this is an example of something like a basic example of how you would set up Ecto in your project for testing. And they do this shared thing here where it's a negative thing that I can never, like I have to read this 13 times always to figure out what this is saying. So it's saying if it's not async, it's not, so it is shared. So you use the shared process if it's not async. If it is async, then not true, so it's not shared. Shared goes into this idea of, should I share my database process between multiple test files, or should I not share them between multiple test files? And in some situations, if you're running non-async code, then it doesn't matter if you're sharing, because the files will be run in the correct order, or they'll be run separately, so you don't have to worry about it. So this is like singing in the wild of this idea of this sharing things in the async world. So I have a couple of solutions to this problem. Some things that we can do about it possibly are, first of all, we could just do async false. Yeah. Thank you. My talk is done. Everything is actually easy with testing. You just need to do async false. But actually, I think that in a lot of cases, async false just makes sense. Like if you have a smaller code base, generally the reason that I wouldn't use async false in a lot of cases with the code that I'm writing is because it will greatly slow down a lot of the tests, and our test suite is already, I don't remember what it is last time I checked, but I think at one point it was a half hour. Sometimes I think it got down to 21 minutes or something like that. So The more async false we have, the more time we have to wait in between pushes. We have multiple members on the team. Like it's a nightmare once the tests get slower and slower. Yeah. So if you have a lot of tests and complexity, but if you do async false and it's still fast, then I mean it lowers a lot of that complexity level. And if you're testing only in one spot, like you're not actually sharing this named process throughout all of your things, then async false is also like just do it. And yeah, so really just if it makes sense to make it easier, then maybe later. The problem that it could lead to is that you might start designing your code around this async false, and then later when you try to refactor things, you will be in for a world of hurt. So just to step in real quick, like what does async true actually mean in testing? It means that test files that are async true are run in parallel, but individual tests within those files are run consecutively. I'm pretty sure in a random order, but one is run right after the other one. So you don't have this asynchronousness within a test file. So what that also means is maybe if you have broken tests and you can move them into the same file, you won't need to do async false, and you can still get away with kind of cheating a little bit. Yeah. So another solution to this problem is a bit uglier, but I use it quite a bit. Is to use a default first argument, which is the name of your module. This kind of, with the trade-off of some ugly code, it gives you an ability to in your this is an example of it in action. So the server or the PID or whatever, you can default to the module name. And then we can also take in here a config name for the name of our server that we're running. And when we are using it in our application code, we can call this code without the server name. This would be our key, and this would be our value that we're setting. But when we're testing, we have the ability to call this code using the server PID, so we can then run it in multiple asynchronous tests when we want to. I use this pattern a lot, this random atom. Generally, you don't want to do things like random atom, especially in application code, because you might run out of memory. But in the context of testing, I think you can get away with random atom. And so this is kind of a way that I generate these process names when I'm testing. Yeah, so fantastic. You can see, like, in the real world where this might become a problem. Say that I am testing PubSub stuff. You can see here that if you generate a new Phoenix application, that it defaults to setting a process name of your PubSub server for you, and this becomes a Singleton. So if you're testing also in this way with the PubSub server, you can run into problems with having multiple instances try and start the PubSub server. So I would generally, if I'm using PubSub, I would have it as some sort of an argument into the gen server that I'm using so that I can then test it more easily. So some trade-offs to consider with this default first argument is you're kind of leaking tests into your production code because you're not actually using this name in your production code. It can be debatable whether how bad that situation is. I get really sensitive at a certain level, but for this, I mean, the alternative is never, for me, the alternative is generally not great sometimes. A lot of people are like, especially when I first saw this, I can remember seeing it for the first time and being like, what the hell is this? Like, what? It's really hard to reason about if you have also default args at the end of the function, it can become, I did for like, while I was writing this talk, I tried to write a function that had both, and it like, I had errors like 2 or 3 times before I figured out how to actually have a default first argument and default last argument. So like, you kind of have to give up on the idea of default end arguments if you want to do this default first argument. Yeah. So the third solution to this singleton problem that I use on a regular basis is dependency injection. So how does dependency injection look in testing and in Elixir? I'm a heavy user of nimble options. And I will create a schema for the arguments for my processes that are running. And then, yeah, I generally will have like the name and other dependencies inside of that. So here's kind of an example of that schema, how you would write it for nimble options. You have this, generally use a module attribute, and you give it the name of the thing, the name of the argument. You give it a type. My indentation is a little bit off here. In this case, you can say you have all the kinds of different types. You can have a tuple, you can have an atom, an integer, a positive integer. You can have a list. You can tell it what can kind of be in the list. So you kind of get this schema for free, which I really like to work with because, I mean, we don't have statically typed language here. So we here we're giving it an array struct, which is required. You can also have these default arguments. And so this is kind of that falling back to the name of pub/sub or the name of the current module you can use too. This name here, I'm using a via tuple, something that you need if you're working with the registry. And yeah, so here is my schema. And then how I use my schema is I will validate my schema with a bang because I want this to explode. Nimble option also gives you pretty good errors. It raises good errors here that tells you kind of what is missing, what is wrong with your schema. I often will do this thing. If I have a name in it, I will split off my my OTP opts from my normal config that goes into it. And that way I can just straight give into my start link, my OTP ops. Maybe I have some other things that I want to throw in there. And yeah, Nimble option also gives you some cool things like you get a type spec for free from your options. You also get documentation for free if you have docs. It's a really, really nice little library. Yeah, and then when I'm testing this thing, you can see that I create this race name, this via tuple. I will start supervised with this child spec, give it the race name, pub/sub server, which I created in some sort of a setup macro somewhere, and the countdown, subscribe, start the race, and then I can wait in the test process to see if I have received this message, which I set up via this pub/sub in my setup. We'll look more into stuff related to that in a little bit. Yeah, so if you like, where I find dependency injection really useful is this. If I'm doing context and GraphQL, for that example in this racing app, like a race itself, which is a dynamic supervisor that's connected to pub/sub and has all of these things that are interacting. I think it's super useful for that, which also makes it easier kind of to start up these dynamic supervisors inside of my application code. Yeah, and you're just naming things with atoms, so you're not giving it you're not throwing the world across these barriers as well. Yeah, and so here is an example of something that I might use for like an absinthe context, where I'm setting up all of these producers and these things in the background, and then I'm grabbing the producer store and throwing that into my context. And then in my actual application code, I'm grabbing the producer store out of the context and then yeah, using all of these things inside of the context. And yeah, so this is one way that I would use this. Like it's great for user login and using repos and things, databases. Yeah, so the other kind of section, the thing that I have a really hard time with in testing with OTP is integration testing. So I'll go a little bit into the complexities of this, of kind of setting up these complex systems before tests. Yeah, so a lot of the time with integration testing, I will need to set up databases, set up message queues, and other state management things. Yeah, and for example, like maybe I need to run migrations, see the database, maybe set up Kafka topics, connect to RabbitMQ topics as well, and channels, and yeah, some other things. We have a lot of in-memory stores in this main application I'm working with. So here's a kind of an example, a genericized version of something like just a setup of one part of a test where that we'd be doing, where you have these multiple services being started, you're setting up these like grid profiles, you're adding these configs, you're starting services, and this might be happening with 2 or 3 services before an integration test starts running. So it can get pretty complex pretty quickly. Here's another example where maybe I need to start a worker pool, a message queue, and a pub sub server. They need to also kind of communicate with each other, and then I need to give them back to the tests that they need to communicate with them after the test setup. Yeah, and then we have all of these things that we're talking to. We're sending messages to pub sub servers. We're asserting receives. So this can get into kind of a nightmare really quickly, especially if you're doing things slightly different across different test files. It can get really, really painful. So assert receive is something that I use quite a bit in this testing of OTP things, of processes, where you're generally giving your test process to a running thing, and then it's sending you messages and you're receiving them. It's super useful. And the first solution that I have for doing these integration testing is using a setup macro. So we'll go into using a setup macro and using kind of this idea of case templates. And the setup macro is something you get with XUnit. It accepts a block, which is generally how we're using it. We use setup something do with a setup block. But we can also give it an atom to name a function. This is similar to plug if you've done that with plug before. We can also give it a module and a function if we need to run a setup from somewhere else, or we can give it a list if we have multiple things that we want to run, or a list of atoms if we want to run multiple functions in that order that are doing our setup. And setup returns either, it's a little bit confusing, it returns either an OK tuple with a keyword or a map, or a keyword or a map, or an OK. I think it just returns an OK as well. I think that's a possibility. Yeah. So returning OK, maybe you're doing something and then you're saying, OK, everything's good to go. Yeah. So here, for example, we're doing a start pub sub server. Start pub sub server would create a random name for it, starting the pub sub server and then returning the name. And then we get the name inside of our test context. So this is one way to kind of set some stuff up in the background. This could also be a list of multiple functions. Yeah, so the other big thing that I use is writing my own case modules. And if you're using a case template, you get this using macro that kind of it's the same as the def macro underscore using. And then what I generally do is set up different functions and things inside of this, which then I can use in my test that I use this in to run some of my setup. And this way, all of this stuff gets encapsulated, and it becomes much more reusable. And you can see here that we're using the setup process pool as a setup. But what we're also doing is you can use tags and then filter on tags here. This is saying if this tag exists, then we do this thing and we return the pub sub back inside of the business there. So yeah, as far as using tags goes, something else is useful is if you want to like have user roles inside of a test, you can in your case file have a bunch of users, and then if the user context, if you have a use role, use that default user, use that user or use a default user if not. Yeah, and if you're a crazy person, you can also use these kind of case files inside of doc tests. And here's an example again of that docs using nimble options. Yeah, so I have to go kind of quick because it looks like I'm out of time. So I will jet through this. I'll have my slides available if you want to look through them for the examples. Yeah. So with mocking, I use mocking a lot. I use the mocks library because it works well with asynchronous tests, while mock doesn't. And in my live views, especially, I will be doing a lot of mocking. I kind of have a rule that if my live view is touching anything external, I'll mock it. And the way that mocks works is you have to define a behavior and then use that behavior. And for example, here I have this power services. I have this behavior inside of it that has this fetch all. Then I implement fetch all, implement the behavior with fetch all inside of my production code. Then somewhere, generally in your test helpers, you will create this def mock, which says that you're using this behavior to create this mock. Then you can use this mock module inside of your tests. And this is how you use it. You have to use this verify and exit. Otherwise, it doesn't verify that your mocks are actually run. You run an expectation, and this has to happen. You can also give it a number of times that it has to happen, or your test fails with the expectation exception or something. Yeah, so you can match, you can do things inside of it, you can return things from it. And then because this power plant is using this external service, yeah, it will, in the background, use this mock. And here you can also use stub. It does the same thing, but you won't fail expectations if your thing doesn't happen. So to configure them, you can either use in your test.exs, you can say use this client, and then inside of your production code, ask, hey, does this thing exist? If not, use the default production code. Otherwise, in your tests, it will use the mock. Another way you can is through dependency injection. As I've shown before, you can just have the services client as something you inject, and then in your tests, you can give it as a dependency. And I highly recommend also using this hammocks project, which it's just a wrapper around mocks. You don't have to change anything. You continue to use mocks, but it also checks to see that you're using the right types into your expectations. So if you change your function signatures and your behaviors, then your tests will fail if you're using the wrong types in your tests. And yeah, so testing OTP is hard. I really have banged my head against my desk many times dealing with this, but hopefully something that you've heard in this talk has made it a little bit easier for you. And yeah, thanks a lot. And yeah, I'd like to have some encouragement to start streaming again. I'd like to start writing tests in this this foot race app that I'm working on. It will be a lot of OTP testing. And if 5 people follow the channel, then I will start next week doing some streams for doing some testing streams. So yeah, encourage me, please. I want to start doing it, but I'm really bad at making myself do it. So yeah, that's everything. And thanks a lot for your attention, and yeah, have a nice rest of your conference.
Yes, Aaron, thank you very much. I think it's nice to see that you've sparked a lot of interest, a lot of questions during your talk. So I think that's also good encouragement for next stream, if you're going to stream. maybe you can go over some of these questions as well.
It's a great idea.
That's just a suggestion. So maybe, if people in the audience, they want to have an answer, they should subscribe to your Twitch as well.
You're great. Do we have zero time for questions?
Because
okay, I'm sorry for going over.
Like
yeah, that sucks.
Officially.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know it sucks, but I'm sorry.
I will, at the very least, I will record. There will be a video of the stream where I answer the questions, and people will be able to, on the channel, watch the video if they want to see.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you.